Hello everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about imaginaries. Now, imaginaries, it's a word that keeps coming up a lot recently. We talk about social imaginaries, collective imaginaries, the imaginary of society, and it's something that we seem to intuitively grasp. However, very few people are actually clear on what that concept means, which is a shame because they are so important to understand current times. So let's go with it. What are they? Okay, so imagine that you want to understand the nature of reality. So we have, of course, the natural world where we have chemistry, physics, biology, nature, the great outdoors, but we are social animals, so we don't only live in the natural world. We have the social dimension where we create art, culture, ideology, politics, markets, economies, states, law. But in order to create all of these phenomena, we need to essentially create a new dimension. And that is what we call the social imaginary. And now you might be thinking, nice, sounds like you just invented another fancy word for culture or ideology. And you may have a point because they are indeed quite similar in some ways, but they are actually different. And the essential difference is that we need an imaginary in order to be able to create these other concepts. So the imaginary is the territory or the background where we create concepts like culture or ideology. And the following question would be, nice, but why does this differentiation matter, like at all? And here's the thing. The truth is that in most cases, it doesn't really matter that much because most of the time, the conversation that we're in or the plane of thinking that we're at doesn't really go that deep, that abstract into the level of imaginaries. However, there are certain times where talking about imaginaries is essential. And those are times where civilization, humanity, is undergoing very deep and massive transformations. Like when we went from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies, or from agricultural societies to the modern industrial ones. Now, in those cases, the types of culture change or mindset change that are needed in order to keep up with everything that's going on in society cannot just happen at the level of culture or ideology, but really needs to be deep at the level of imaginaries. And I know that this is quite abstract, so let me give you a very true history-based example. So some of you might have heard of this quote by Ursula K. Le Guin, who is the absolute queen of imaginaries, that says that the power of capitalism may seem inescapable, but so did the divine right of kings. And this quote is super important because it points out to the fact that imaginaries tend to be constructed around some key concepts that dictate essentially how we perceive our whole social existence. So let's dig deep into that. Now let's look back quite some years into our pre-modern social imaginary, that is the Middle Ages. Now in those times, our whole social order was constructed around the idea of God, the divine king, and the underlying mythological order of the cosmos. Now those ideas inform everything about our whole social world and social existence, like how we perceive ourselves, where basically here our whole worth as a person is directly related to how close I am to God, which if you're a priest or a king or a noble, quite a lot, but if you're a peasant, it's essentially zero. Or how we relate it to others, like forget notions of equality, like that's cute. No, here what matters is the divine order of the universe, where everyone is exactly where God intended them to be. No matter if you're a priest, a peasant, or a princess, you're exactly in your right place. And of course, they also affect how we perceive the broader systems that we're ingrained in. Like, for example, how should we take decisions? Or how do we know what's good? Or who should rule things? Well, of course, it's all according to God's word. And love it or hate it, the truth is that this story worked relatively well until the 18th century came, with the scientific and industrial revolutions, and of course, the modern enlightenment. And at this point, the story of gods and kings just didn't really cut it anymore. And gradually, a new story starts to emerge. Now, we're talking about the market economy and the revolutionary idea of nation states, not ruled by kings, but by sovereign individuals. And instead of looking at the world exclusively through the divine order and God's word, now rationality comes into place. Which now, these concepts might seem extremely obvious because we just live ingrained in them, but then that was extremely revolutionary. And so slowly but surely, all these concepts started to permeate and infiltrate every aspect of our social life. Now, we don't think of ourselves anymore as mere servants of our God, of our King. No, now we are proud citizens of our nations and productive members of the economy. And instead of just accepting God-given hierarchies, now we think of ourselves as autonomous, goal-driven individuals that we can collaborate with each other and make agreements that we should stick to them with honor and responsibility. Well, at least if you're a white man. And that thing about just ruling the whole of society according to God's word, how embarrassing. No, now we have the scientific method, secular humanism, and economic rationality. And we're able to measure everything and see how effective things really are. And we try to implement at least some kind of meritocracy that is based on reason and efficiency and not just on religious ideology. Now, of course, this doesn't really happen on a conscious level. Imaginaries are more like the collective unconscious. So it's not like we just go around every day explicitly thinking, oh, I must be a productive member of society today or else I'll be completely worthless. No, this manifests on a much more subtle level. Like, for example, when we tie our identity so much with our profession. And you know the classic story here. You meet someone, you say your name, and then 2 seconds later, what do? Or it's also the reason why our idea of making it or of success is essentially identical with being a high achiever in the modern economy. Or my personal favorite, when we feel this deep existential guilt and even worthlessness when we are not being as productive as we'd like to. And oh my God, the pandemic absolutely hit us hard there. But it's okay. I know there's no shame. We've all been there. It's not us, it's the imaginary. And you know that thing that I was saying before, that imaginaries are the background where we create concepts like culture or ideology? Well, that is just so painstakingly clear when you realize that the main ideologies that we invented in the modern age, they all essentially refer either to the economy, like communism, capitalism, socialism, or to the nation state, like fascism. So as you see, imaginaries are incredibly powerful. They really are like the dark matter of society that holds everything together, or like the deep code that's running us without us being aware of that. But despite of all their power, or precisely because of their power, the truth is that imaginaries remain completely invisible to us. And that's why a very common metaphor to refer to them is to say that imaginaries are like water for the fish. So it's something that is all around us, that we are completely ingrained in and that we need for living. However, we are completely unaware of them. But still, we must make an effort in really trying to understand them, because at the point where society is at, with all the massive transformations that are happening right now, the kinds of change that need to happen, that culture change, that systems change, that revolution, TM, can't just happen at the level of culture or ideology. Really needs to be much deeper at the level of the imaginary. Because looking back at the way that we transitioned from pre-modern Middle Ages to the modern society, the modern Enlightenment imaginary, was not just through arguing which king is best or which god is best, because we know that these discussions only got us stuck in endless wars and crusades. No, what we had was a radical reimagination of our whole society in a way that we created new concepts that transcended those of gods and kings. So similarly, today, the discussion at the level of how can my country do it best, or which is the best way to organize the economy? Well, it's not that they're not needed, but they won't be enough. In these times, the kind of change that we need requires, again, a much more radical reimagination of our whole social existence. And again, we need to create new concepts that include but move beyond the ideas of the economy and nation states. We need to start asking questions like, in the age of globalization and automatization, how do we perceive ourselves beyond the life of a hard worker of the economy and a proud citizen of our country? Or in the age where we are constantly interacting with diverse people and perspectives, and where fixed roles and identities seem to constantly dissolve, how do we then know what good, fair, and meaningful relationships look like? Or in the age of climate change, which new standards do we set for ourselves that go beyond efficiency? Or in the age of infinite data and information overwhelm, and of systems thinking and complexity science, and where we're only now starting to awaken to the interconnectedness of all of our systems, how do we then know what is true? how do we make sense of the world? That is a deep kind of imaginary change that I'm talking about. How do we then create that kind of change? And here's where the tricky part comes. Because imaginaries, rather than being intellectual theories that we can create about how the world works or how the world should work, are more like the ways of being that emerge out of the way the world actually works. So, in this case, it's just not enough to gather a bunch of thinkers, a bunch of philosophers, to theorize about how should the new utopia look like. While we don't need the theories, imaginaries aren't actually made of them. They are made of stories, images, metaphors, myths, memes, that without us knowing, they just shape and run our collective imagination and provide us with direction and meaning, but in a much more subtle and evocative way. So yes, we don't need the philosophers, but in terms of imaginary, we especially need the artists, the storytellers, the creatives, the meme makers, all these people who are engaged in the work of translating theory into imaginary, and that create the stories and the universe that without us knowing, we all live and breathe. And then, what we also need in these uncertain times is for everyone, that instead of trying so hard to go back to our old notions of normality or stability, well, maybe we can start to be more present in the current moment and more open and perceiving to other ways of being, of doing, of relating, or of knowing that wouldn't have been really apparent to us before, but that make much more sense for the new world that wants to emerge. And it's maybe then, when everyone's playing their role well, that new imaginary will be born.